Hello folks, welcome to the River Wye at Hereford and a bit of a special edition of the review. Because in this issue we're not so much looking just at a product, we're also looking at more of an instructional piece explaining how a particular float pattern works, because we get loads of questions about these things, flat floats. There's lots of different shapes out there, lots of different kinds. Dave, I'm going to say, is one of the finest, if not the finest river anglers in the country, and he's certainly caught more than his fair share of fish on flat floats. So, we've got three different types with us, which I think cover 90% of this field, don't they?
They do, and there is, like many things, there's a wide array out there, but you can usually find these things down to a certain amount that are actually useful, Tom. And I think that's what we'll do today. We'll look at three patterns that I would use in this sort of arena and most of the rivers in this country, really.
So, flat floats generally, Dave, are used to slow bait down or hold it still in a flowing water, aren't they? That's a fair assessment.
Yeah, it's basically, I think hydrodynamics, would that be a word, Tom?
Dave, you pulled that out of the bag so early.
I've been waiting to get that in for a long time. But yeah, no, I think that's what it's about, isn't it? It's about, lowering the resistance between, of your float as you're trying to slow a float down. Before the age of flat floats, we'd use bigger round-bodied floats. Oh, there we go, straight away. And overshot them, but with these sorts of floats we can generally fish a lighter float. It's actually a little chub that time, Tom.
Beautiful. First time I've seen you with a chub on today, that Dave, I think.
Well, there you go, won't be the last, Tom. But yeah, so basically it slows your bait down without having to fish too heavy a float, and we've actually picked probably the perfect day to come and do it. I wouldn't say day temperature wise, it was -4 last night, Tom, but we've got a river that was over the banks 3 days ago, but has fined off, and we've got about 6 foot of extra, 6 foot above summer level. So we've got a fair bit of water on, but as you can see, fish are willing to feed in this if you can just present it right.
Yes. Yeah.
And of course what you're battling against is you've got to make the choice, and especially in match fishing terms, would you be better off fishing a feeder today than fishing with a flat float, or any float for that matter? Because it's all about horses for courses, choosing the right method on the day, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But as you can see, already we're into a little rhythm with this. We've got dace and chub, and I'm sure we'll see a roach or two at some stage feeding, and we're presenting right. So at the moment, it seems like flat float might be the right method.
Absolutely. I just want to make a really simple point, because one question I've been asked a lot is, why use flat floats? Why do I need to? Now, if we were tackling this peg today without flat floats, Dave, what size bodied rig would we need to achieve this sort of presentation?
Well,
20 gram? Yeah,
at least I would, and you'd be overshotting. We've got a 15 gram flat float on there, and that's, it seems to be right, it's working. So yeah, you can only assume that you'd need, something another quarter of the size of that, with extra shots on. Which again, just adds more unbalance to the rig, doesn't it? You imagine that's more weight you've got to lift, strike through. If you've got a fish on the end, it's less feel, things like that. So if you can use a lighter float and still gain the same presentation, then it's got to be.
I think as well on this sort of venue, and often with this sort of fishing, it's a numbers game, isn't it? At the end of the day, and having a bigger float with bigger weight bouncing around, you're going to lose more fish. So it might be that Joe Bloggs next to you with a round-bodied float, you might still catch 20 pound, 50 fish, but you on the next peg might catch 60 fish for 25 pound, because you've got that extra advantage to your presentation. They just give you an edge, don't they, on this sort of fishing?
Definitely. And as we know, especially in winter on rivers, it's about slowing your baits down, and without actually putting a bait on a feeder, if you're fishing a feeder, I can't see a better way of doing it, I'll be honest.
So I will just touch very briefly on that as well. I mean, I fished the festival here, not last year, the year before, and that was a feeder river, wasn't it? And that's when maybe you can't hold the bait still with a flat float. At that point, you do need that ability to present a static bait, and a pole feeder or a feeder becomes the method, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'll be honest, Tom, I have a little rule of thumb with flat floats. If I need more than 15 grams, I tend to fish feeder. That tells me I need to be fishing feeder. So
they're not always right.
No, and and like I say, you can waste you've got to be careful, because you can spend a lot of time trying to make it work, and you'll be getting an odd bite. But when you look at the reality, is you're not catching as quick as you would if you're just dropping a little feeder on the same line. So it is tricky, but it's just such a nice way to catch. And if you've got everything ready, you know, we're still early into the session here. We're still trying to get everything right and play around with the rig a little bit and things like that. Work out what the right rig is. Obviously, we've got an array of floats set up today, because we've
got an array and array.
I knew what I did there. I knew what I did there, Tom. But we want
to
to
work on many levels, don't you?
I do. I'm generally on upper levels, Tom. But no, we want to show people the different things that are available. And but at this stage, we're just sort of feeling our way in. And what I have found with this game, Tom, is you could have a river that's the same level 2 days running, but the fishing would never be the same 2 days running. The rig you'd need to change your rig the next day or something.
It was interesting you said today, didn't you, that this river sometimes drops in level, so you'd presume the flow would be dropping, but actually the flow can increase.
Yeah, it picks up as it pulls off, you know, as it goes lower. So yeah, you just never know, and you're constantly, as with any fishing, and especially running line fishing, you're always tinkering and playing around and to get the right thing. And what you're looking for is that perfect combination that sees you dropping your rig in, catching a fish, swinging out and doing the same thing over and over again. And that's when you know you've got it right.
Okay, so this ray, this Crusoe ray that we're using at the moment, 15 grams. We've got a bulk of drill bullets around about 18 inches from the hook, and just is it just one dropper on this one?
Yeah, I've just put no, sorry, on this one at the moment they're strung out. So I've got 3 number 6s, and they're strung out at the moment. Now, again, what I was saying earlier about sort of it never been the same 2 days running. Quite often, this rig is at its best when you just I could have those 2 number 6s together. So like I do like a number 4 below the bulk, and it's as simple as that. You don't need anything else. But on other days, stringing them out can work. And that's where I say the sort of tinkering comes in, because there's no set pattern to it. I would never say, oh, that's the way you must fish. And today, at the moment, I've got them strung out, but I might push them together in a bit if I feel like it's pinning the bait down a bit more and that sort of thing. But it's an incredibly simple setup. It's not complicated. A bulk and so many droppers, is it?
No, it's not. But
it's just making sure it's fishing at the right depth, and obviously, probably the most important one to start with is the right size float.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So obviously with this float we've got on here, this ray, we're using it for what I'd call inching. So you're sort of holding back the rig, then letting it run through. If you try to hold that dead still, in fact, just show them what happens if you hold it dead still.
Okay, so holding it dead still.
The float rides out the water, and that's not presenting properly anymore, is it? Even though you've nailed one on it.
That's it, Tom, you just nailed it.
But for that, there's another float which we're going to show for holding a bait dead still.
So basically, if you wanted to hold a bait dead still out there in that float today, you'd need about probably a 40 gram flat float, which again, you'd be better off fishing a feeder. So it's a case of finding that balance. You're never going to be holding it dead still in this sort of flow. So like I say, it's about inching it through, but you know, slowing everything in the winter is about slowing things down, isn't it? And that's what this rig is doing, is slowing it down. But as you say, inching. But if I hold it back too hard, obviously it rides up. If I let it go through too quick, it goes under, because you know we are overshot in these floats. I've tried fishing them, shotted properly, so they're just sort of so you shot it so it's like a normal pole float, so it's down to a dimple or whatever. And I just always invariably end up overshotting them, Tom. And I think most people are the same. I think I just think they work better with more shot,
It's that resistance thing again, though, isn't it? If you think about an overshotted float, there's less resistance, it's working better.
Yeah.
It's got to be, hasn't it?
It is. So, I definitely overshotted, but not by too much. And that's where I think people do make mistakes with flat floats is it's not sitting right, so they'll add more shots on. I've always got a tub of Swan shots or AAs by me, and you add one and it sits right, but you can end up adding loads on. All of a sudden, you're really just fishing a tight line. Because the float almost becomes bypassed by the weight. There's so much weight down the line that the float almost becomes an irrelevance. And I'll tell you a classic sign to watch out for if you end up doing that is you'll feel the bites through the pole tip.
Yes.
You feel a tap and then
you're almost fishing a pole feeder.
You've got too much weight on the line. So it is it's not an exact science, but it's something that's got to be right and choosing the right float. But generally, I think look at your bristle. Look at how it's sitting in the water. and if it's sat like that, then it's just too light.
Absolutely. So with this, we're looking for the float to be, I'm going to say, relatively straight when you hold on to it, cocking back towards you.
Yeah.
Not so. For example, if we've got one of these on that was too big, you would be able to hold it still, wouldn't you?
Yeah. So they say with stuff I've seen surrounding the sort of Crusoe floats and that sort of thing, they do say like, oh, it should be, the right float is when it's sat at 90 degrees. I don't agree with that, not on this venue anyway, because I just don't think you ever get that.
No.
I think as long as it doesn't go more than, what would you say, 45 degrees, so say about 60 degrees, I'd say that's fine, because at the end of the day, that's running through. If a fish touches that, you'll get a bite. That's fine. That's fishing to me.
This is working, isn't it? This is how it should be at the moment, I'd say.
And I think the other thing is as well is it's not the float. Like I say, the float just feels, you feel in control. And listen, a lot of that comes from doing it and experience, but I feel like the float is doing what I want it to do at the moment.
Absolutely, that's working perfectly, isn't it? You're able to inch that bait through over probably an area of about 3 metres in total.
Yeah, it is, and we're feeding all the time, so we're getting a real trail of bait, an area, you're always looking for that hot spot, aren't you? That place in the swim where the float goes under every time, and it is and that's the hardest thing about this is, you're fishing with 6 foot of extra water on. How do you get that accuracy that you would get on a feeder, or where the fish comes straight? So it does require plenty of thought in how you're feeding and what you're feeding to try and get to that spot where you get that hot spot.
Absolutely.
You see the pegs just started boiling up a bit now. The flow's changed, so you just got to be careful, and if that became a constant, then I'd probably have to change rig again.
No, that makes total sense. So that's a ray float explained. It's an inching float really, isn't it?
Yeah, so we'll just have we showed it before, we'll have a look at the shape of it just so people understand the sort of different shapes of these floats. This is like a traditional, not traditional, there's nothing traditional about flat floats, but the shape of it is round, isn't it? It's a round disc
almost,
yeah. And a flat disc, and that's basically that's not getting too much pressure off the flow, and it's allowing us just to inch it through.
A few important things on that as well. We attach the flat float to the line using 3 pieces of silicone rubber, basically, or 4 in total. 3 down the stem and 1 on the little arm to the side. Always have your last rubber overhanging the end of your float, and always have the rubber on the arm of the flat float overhanging as well to stop tangles. And the other thing, Dave, I noticed on that, you've got a nice long length of line between your pole tip and your float.
Yeah, so like I say, if you're too close to it, I mean, it's all about how we're fishing. We're fishing to hand as well, so that plays a part in that. But you don't want lots of line between, you don't want too much line, because you lost that one, Tom. Too much line, you're too slow on the bite, and you lose sort of a bit of control as well on, especially if you get a bit of breeze or something. So it is there's no set rule to it, but it does need to be right.
Absolutely.
Another little tip as well on these, I noticed as well, when you've got the way these floats are, you said about the silicone rubber overlapping the top arm, and also then we've got 3 rubbers down. It's important that bottom rubber there, the one directly under the float, isn't too close to the float.
Of course.
Because what you don't want your line touching this body.
No.
Because if it touches that, it tends to vibrate and it makes the float a bit unstable.
Yes.
So you always have that, so there's that angle from the line, so it totally misses the body out on that section there. That's very important. Someone taught me that. I didn't realise that when I first started using them.
So that's what you do see sometimes, don't you? People in the flat float, you're almost shaking as you hold it. That's why. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. If you see a flat float shaking, there's 2 things happening. It's either that, or they've got shots on the bottom.
Yeah.
Which is, it's not allowed in international rules, but it's also
counterproductive.
but it also it means the float's not working properly.
Absolutely. So we'll catch one more on this, and then we'll have a look at the torpedo, I think, shall we?
I think so, and I think you can have a go on that one, Tom. I will let you have a go today.
Oh, thank you. Right, Dave, on now to Crusoe torpedoes. Now, these are the first ever flat floats that I use.
Yes, me too.
I used to use these on the Warwickshire Avon at Evesham fishing for eels, and obviously very different flow and river level to what we've got here today. It was much more about holding a static bait in a bump bar and waiting for an eel to find it on quite a slow river. But you can see straight away with this float we're able to hold things much more still, basically.
Yeah, it's a much slower presentation. That looks like a bite. Oh, look
There
at
we
that.
are,
Straight
look
away
at
into it, Tom. So yeah, it's giving you a much slower presentation, which is, you know, probably what we're looking for today in these sort of conditions. You know, the best fishing is always when you can run it at them, but ultimately when conditions get hard, fish want to still a bait. What we were saying earlier about feeder fishing possibly being better in certain conditions, but that's certainly straight away that shape of that body is, you know, these, like you say, they're designed for holding a float still. If you watch the World Championships and the international anglers, they you know, they're using much bigger floats than this a lot of the time, but they are holding a very still bait. And this was exactly like you. This was the first my first proper awareness of flat floats was seeing the videos of these being used by it was the Eastern Europeans, Hungarians, I think, who were sort of using them.
Absolutely. So with this, again today, it's not easy to do actually, because we're actually trying to hold that dead still. And the bite straight away there. And we've got probably a bit too much pace for this float. Unfortunately, that's not something you can always control, is it really?
No. And I think
on a dropping river.
Yeah, and I think also venues change. You'll go to some venues where it flows hard, but it's a real even flow.
Yes.
Whereas here you've got lots of boils and different things going on, so it doesn't always lend itself well to holding a bait still here. But if you can hold it like you are, you're holding that fairly still, and it's a nice slow run right over what I would say is hopefully our hot spot, our killing zone. I think that's your best. You know, it's probably the best presentation we could have today.
Absolutely. So in terms of the shape of these floats, slightly different. I always describe them to people as a bit like a D shape, aren't they, really, in many ways?
Yeah.
Again, with that arm coming off the back. But with these, it's very much more, as I said, about holding them than running them.
Yeah, and I think this is where these were the first floats that really looked at the, dare I use the word again, hydrodynamics of how floats, you know, sort of behave when flowing water. And these are the ones, they also come with a tuning, they call it the willow leaf, don't they, which have got they've got like a plastic thing that sits between the bristle and the arm, and it almost pushes the float down.
I'll tell you a funny story about them. So when I was a novice river angler a few years ago, I got my torpedoes quite proudly, got them out and put them on the line with these tuning strips on, which I thought looked perfect. Didn't realise you meant to take them off the bristle, off the stem of the float, and actually put them over to the top of the float. But you live and you learn.
Yeah, but yeah, they are. You know, there was a lot of thought there gone into them, and they do sit straight. And actually, I'll tell you a story as well. And this is, you know, before I'd really used them much, but I was party to a conversation about flat floats, and it was none other than Will Raisin, who obviously with a wealth of international experience, was talking about it after he was fishing the festival here, and we were talking one evening over dinner, and it was, and he was saying that when they were quite often on international duty, they always said that these Crusoe floats were so good at the way they sit in the water that quite often they'd look like they were sitting right, even though they were too light.
Yes.
So he said quite often on practice, and I apologise if I'm misquoting what he said here, but this is the way I understood it. He said quite often they put a different, like a more traditional flat float, like a disc flat float on.
Yes.
To find out what was the right grammage to be using, and then once they got that, then they put on a Crusoe in that weight, because the danger was if they went with Crusoe, they could actually choose a float that was too light because they sit so well.
With you.
And so he said, yeah, they put on a disc flat float first to get the right grammage, and then they'd use the Crusoes, which I just found it a fascinating conversation, and you know, a different way of looking at flat float fishing, really.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
That does sit really nicely though. That's certainly been, you know, I like those rays. Rays are my favourite float.
And mine actually.
But I have to say, in these conditions today, that seems to be sitting just right to me.
Small chub, that one. And it's interesting as well, Dave, through no real brand favouritism. I mean, obviously, we said we'd talk about this from a technical point of view today as well as just the review, but we've both opened our flat float boxes this morning, and it's a plethora of Crusoe floats. Now we have both got some others. I know the next float we're going to look at is actually a Sensors float. I like the Sensors Edmonds as well for running through on slower rivers. When I used to fish the Soar Winter League a lot, I'd always have an Edmonds set up on there. It was perfect for just inching a float through on that slower flowing water. But on here, you know, we both favour Crusoes just because, well, they work, don't they? At the end of the day.
I think that they work, and the other thing I've found, Tom, unfortunately, is obviously this venue is a little bit harsh on your gear, and I just find other floats just don't last.
Yeah.
They fall apart, plain and simple. And you know, I like you. I like the Edmonds, those Sensors Edmonds. I've got a few of those, and I do use them, but I just find their longevity. You know, I'm someone who likes to make a rig box up and then make it last. You know, I don't want to be spending all my time making rigs.
Absolutely.
So yeah, my sort of I've fed up with seeing broken floats and damaged floats and perch. There you go. That's the first one of those we've had today, Tom.
Lovely.
Should we net that one,
I
Tom?
think we should.
I'll net it for you, Tom. And that shows, you know what I mean, that presentation is good. That, you know, you're getting that still presentation, flat float perch.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, that's for me a beauty.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, for me, that I would say the main reason my box is full of Crusoes is because of their longevity and their robustness, I'd say.
Yeah.
But that's not to say there aren't other floats that do a really good job, and I do use them. I've got them set up.
Absolutely. So that, in a nutshell, is the torpedo. Different presentation again, isn't it?
It is, and I think interestingly, you know, I still felt like the Ray would be the right one today, or that shape float, but straight away I think we're seeing that today is the torpedo is the one at the moment. I mean, and we've got change in flow, and it might change as the day goes on. But I think there is also, you know, there's a few intricacies of this sort of fishing as well that you can play around. If you know, sometimes you'll be getting bites or suck maggots, so you're not seeing bites, and you know, you can play around with your dropper shots and things like that. And it's there's so many different things to do. But straight away, just the basic fact is our bristle is sitting straighter. We're getting longer. We're getting a much slower run through the peg, and I think that just feels right, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. It's proved so as well, hasn't it, up to now, with probably more bites on this than the other float, I'd say.
Yeah, I kind of wish I was fishing with this float, Tom.
If you were fishing with this float, there wouldn't be enough room for chat. There'd be too much action.
Yeah, right. Is that right?
One other thing about this, when you're holding a float still, I personally often like to just dip the tip of the pole under the water like I've got there.
Yeah.
It just helps you keep it really still and minimise any movement on that line between the pole tip and the float. Are you the same, Dave, with that?
Yeah, and I do find as well with your presentation, you're forever moving, lifting and lowering the pole tip. You know, you're reacting to the way the float's sinking, because as it's edging through, the flow changes and it'll pull it under sometimes. Sometimes it'll rise up. If it rises up, you lower your pole tip, and if it drops down too far, you just lift the pole tip so you get lift a bit of air into it. So it's never just one sitting in one position. Like say when you talk about fishing the Avon for eels, you know, you're fishing fairly sedate water. You can do that. You just sit with the pole in one position.
Yeah.
What's happened, Tom? You started missing bites.
No, we've started missing a few bites. Yeah.
You had it nailed.
We had a good little run.
You were impressive.
I won't go that far.
You were like lightning.
Let's not get carried away, Paul.
No.
Let's not get carried away. But no, you have got to take care with putting your pole under the water, though. Especially, it's not so bad with a whip, but do that little dink dink. Oh, you pig! You've got to take care, though, haven't you, with putting your pole tip under the water, because if you're not careful, it can fill with water if you're fishing with a long pole. And what sometimes happens then is, on your strike, it's full of water and it snaps your number 4. I've not done that myself. I'll be honest.
I've not done it, and I've not done enough long pole flat float fishing to experience it. But I am told as well, if you've got side pullers, they suck the water up.
Yes.
That air hole creates some sort of vacuum, and so it's even worse with a side. You can't use side pullers, you know, with big flat floats apparently. But.
Oh, this flow has probably changed again. We're just not quite getting the bites that we were. So is it time to have a switch to the final rig that we're going to look at, the running
Yeah,
one?
I think we're doing things probably quicker than we normally would, but I think if we have a look at the other rig, and then hopefully what we'll do is we'll find a rig that's best, and I've got a feeling it's going to be this rig, and then we can tinker with this rig to make it work, to make it.
Yeah, show
To
some of the
optimise it,
little
maybe.
tweaks that you
Yeah.
can. And it's interesting, as we're going down the peg there, Dave, it's really boiling now, isn't it, on,
Yeah.
on that right-hand line, which is a problem we didn't have earlier.
Mm.
Oh, that was on and off. Let's have a look at that final rig. I'll let you get back on the box and we'll do that.
For a dog.
So we've got a pattern on now that, I must be honest, I've never used one of these. I've used
No,
very similar
I
ones.
can't think what they're called, Tom. I must find out. We must find out what they are. So basically, this is the traditional round disc float, but it's got an offset bristle. So the idea being it's sitting back. So the idea is that when it's sitting at an angle like that, the bristle is actually upright. So it looks better. Aesthetically, it looks better, but it's still fishing the same.
And this is again designed for inching, really.
Yeah,
isn't it?
this is not for holding still. So this is a 12 gram pound, which I feel is just probably too light today. I think we might get bites on it, but I don't feel like it's going to be the float. Maybe later on as the river finds off. There was a bite. Oh, there we go. Maybe I'll take it back, Tom. Maybe it might be the perfect rig. But this is definitely a running through rig. I say it's lighter than the other ones we've been fishing, 12 grams. And I've got three number 6 shots spread out below the bulk. And literally just lowering it in and inching it through. So there's no probably going through 3 times the speed the other rigs were going through.
I've got to ask them, when would you use that as opposed to a ray?
So I would be looking when conditions are good, when the fish are really bear in mind it's very cold, and we were saying that's usually synonymous with slowing baits down and fishing feeders, that sort of thing. But if this was autumn and we had this sort of pace, I'd be expecting to catch running a bait at them, fish coming, being real aggressive, coming at your bait, and that would be the time when these would come into their own. And I generally think they'd be the first choice float, or a float of similar pattern. It would be less about holding it still and more about running it through our feed and catching a fish a chuck.
That was nice, wasn't it? We nailed it on the way down. That one.
Yeah, so it's not, it's a roach as well.
Lovely fish.
Is it a roach? No. Yeah, it's a roach.
Gorgeous.
So there you go. It's not, I honestly thought that I was going to be, when we picked this up, I'd be fishing the wrong float.
I thought the ray would be the one, and actually,
Yeah.
it's been, I wouldn't say it's been the worst, but it's certainly been...
What I would say, Tom, with these floats is the setup is paramount. So, how you put it in, how you inch it through. It's not just a case of just dropping it in and running it and it goes. There's a lot of control here. If you haven't got the steadiness to hold it, it doesn't work. You get more bites with better presentation, as we know, and these sort of floats kind of epitomise that, really.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's.
One other thing just to talk about quickly, obviously we both sort of favour drilled bullets, I think, as our main way of shotting these rather than Olivettes. For me, I just think you want to spread when you're dealing with any sort of flow, and trying to hold one against the flow even more so. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you've got to be careful you don't have too much, too long. You've got to use the right sized bullets. You don't want them too long, because I feel like then you just create a wall for the flow to push against. But yeah, definitely better than having just one lump of weight or a long lump of weight. Just something.
Okay, so we've looked at all the different kinds of floats. We've looked at some census floats, or a census float there, and a couple of Caluso patterns. Let's go back to one now and just wrap this up really with a few final tweaks that you might make. What do you want to change back to before we finish?
I mean, this rig certainly looks like it could work. I think I'd probably, if we took another foot of water off, I'd probably be, maybe airing towards this float. But I think certainly the float that you were sat with, I'd like to have a go with that with the torpedo, because that seemed to sit the best. And I do feel like it is still a day where we need to hold our bait still. That's the one that will hold it straight over top of our ground bait, nice and still. and give us a chance of a bite every cast. You know, rather than a fish every 2 or 3 runs through, or even 4 or 5 runs through, one that potentially could give us a fish a chuck, which is what's going to give you the best weight at the end of the match.
Absolutely. So again, it's just about refining your choices to give you maximum efficiency, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Right. So here we are then. The torpedo is all yours. So at the moment on this, we've got 2 shot down the line, 2 number 6s. We've got probably 18 inches of line between the hook and the last dropper.
So I think this will be the rig, and I just feel that what I've found with these rigs, I've caught quite a few fish on them this year actually. I'll pass you that one. It's generally, once you've got the right weight float, so this is a 15 gram pattern, and I feel like that's right for the flow we've got in front of us. As I said to you earlier, if I had to go more than 15 gram, I'd be casting a feeder out. But I think 15 grams a good weight. So for me now, it's just about how we nail it and how we get those regular bites. And the changes with that for me would be about the droppers below the bulk. I say some people just as steadfast, they'll just fish with one dropper or a string of droppers and that. For me, I change it every match, every session is different. And I feel that'll be the key here to really sort of getting regular bites. So we'll go with because you were catching quite well on this earlier on. So I think we'll go with that and just get a feel for what's going on, and then we'll try a couple of different variations and see if we get a different result. Lovely. It's a lovely, you really hold, we're getting so much time over top of our ground bait, and that's key.
And it's worth saying as well, I know we touched on it, but watercourses do change as levels change, don't they? Like that is dropping. We're seeing more boils now than we were before on this line.
It's a lot more uneven now, isn't it? So yeah, I think you've got to react. That's it'd be the same whatever you were doing. If you were running line, if you're fishing bolo or stick floats, if the flow changed, we'd have to change our rigs or adjust. And this is so much what fishing's about, and especially match fishing is adjusting, isn't it? That's what the key is. It's if something's working, great, but it's when it stops working, how quickly you can change and adjust, make those changes to get back on track as quick as possible, because a quiet 20 minutes, half an hour is the difference between winning and losing sometimes, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So that's our first fish back on the rig.
Dace. So what would you change? What would be in your toolbox, shall we say, to improve things?
So my main thing, and this is the same with a lot of pole rigs I use, my main thing are these droppers here.
Yeah.
So some people like to have a big dropper and one more and then nothing. Generally I have nothing within sort of like 15 inches of my hook. But especially if I feel like it's not quite holding steady, I'll pull these 2 number 6s together. So I've effectively got 1 number 4.
Yeah.
And I've got other ones out under the float that I could pull down as well. So I'll just try that for a second. Let's just try with the 2 number 6s together and just see if that has any bearing on things.
Let's talk a little bit about hooks as well while you're doing that. I always think with flat float fishing you want a hook that can basically withstand you striking through the weight of a float. So something with a reasonably thick gauge. You never like fine wire hooks for flat float fishing, do you?
No, you've got, like you say, you're striking through 15 grams of weight. Heavy elastic, a decent elastic. You can't use a fine wire pattern. So we've got a size 12 on there, and and it's a pattern I trust, and I feel like a 14 or a 16 would be too small. Even sometimes I'm fishing like a single bait on a size 12. It is very positive fishing, but it needs to be.
Absolutely.
What's happening there? I don't know what's happening there.
It's interesting, since we changed that, the float is definitely sitting a bit differently. Do you think that shot's maybe on the bottom now?
It might be. We might, and the river's dropped a little bit now, so we might just need to just shallow up a touch. And that's that sort of highlights it, that if things aren't quite right, if the mechanics of it aren't right, then the float doesn't fish right, and that's not going to get you bites.
Absolutely.
See, it's going through a bit quicker. You know, we're just pushing it through a bit quicker than we were. So something's changed. Also, you know, something's not right with the way we've changed those shots.
Oh, there we are.
Ooh,
Oh,
that was possibly foul up, that one. I don't know. Let's try that again. But generally, those are the changes. Once I know I've got the right size float on, which I believe we have, then it's, for me, it's about these sort of the bottom end of the rig and how, you know, maybe changing depth.
I was
Maybe
just going to say that might be the two things really,
Yeah.
depth and for me it certainly is. It's that bottom third or bottom fifth often, isn't it, on a flat float rig,
yeah.
and it's how far over depth you are really. Generally though, I don't know whether you'd say the same, Dave, but to me with flat floats, more is normally better than less. You normally want a fair bit on the bottom.
Yeah, yeah, you're always dragging line along the bottom, and
I think I've come unstuck more when rivers come up than I have when it's dropped.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that said, though, some days just running it through with a string of shots off the bottom, just off bottom, can really work. But I think the other thing to point out with this as well is, and I think people get lost in this a little bit, that it's not always about the float going under.
No.
Generally, your float doesn't go under with this sort of fishing. It's sometimes it's just like a shake.
Yeah.
The float, you know, it just rises up. You get like almost like a lift bite.
Yeah.
You know, so don't fish flat floats expecting the float to sail under every time. It's like
Sometimes isn't the case.
yeah.
Is it?
I mean, don't get me wrong. I bet when you were fishing the Avon for eels, it did. You know, then you were waiting for a bite where
3
it sailed.
seconds count after was the rule. Me and Matt had.
That's it.
God save the Queen and then strike.
That's
Yeah.
it. Well, there you go. But in this instance, you just never would. It will. The float will go under. But if it's going under from a bite, there's a good chance that the fish has already ejected the bait, or you might pull out that fish. You've got to learn to react to different ways, and that's another case of no 2 days being the same. So just like then, my float just popped up. So I thought I'll just try striking just in case it's a fish, because I've bulked those 2 number 6s together. It could be like a conventional lift bite.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And as the session progresses, you learn to know what different movements on the float are bites and which ones aren't. But I would definitely suggest, like early on, strike at anything that just looks different.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully that's been useful for you folks. A little look into how we approach flat float fishing. It's been great for me to pick Dave's brains as well. As I said, he's one of the very best on this river and a real expert on this sort of fishing. Any sort of questions, drop them in the comments below, but hopefully that's proved useful.